is true recognition of the service that so many people have given our country.
Smith.
We remain committed to maintaining the overall size of the armed forces, and we have a range of measures underway to improve recruitment and retention. The challenge is kept under constant review. Importantly, the services continue to meet all of their current commitments, keeping the country and its interests safe.
Royston Smith.
Having served in the Royal Air Force, I know how rewarding a life in the military is, but also how demanding it can be. And I also know how difficult recruitment and retention is, particularly retention. Has my right honourable friend considered things such as free Wi-Fi for military personnel to help them and their families feel less isolated when they are serving away from home?
Well, we recognise the importance of connectivity for our personnel, and I'd like to reassure my honourable friend that for those serving on operations, the MOD will pay for internet connections to enable personnel to connect with families and friends. And for those on non-operational tours abroad, the Wi-Fi costs are also covered through a welfare package.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One way to retain more Royal Marines is to ensure the accommodation therein is of high quality. As Plymouth is no longer getting the super base we were promised, could the Minister set out how the facilities at Stonehouse Barracks will be increased, including making sure that all the accommodation blocks have hot water and good heating?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware that it's a complex programme that was announced through the Better Defence Estate strategy. On the specific issue that he raises, I'm told that my right honourable friend, the member for Bournemouth, is intending to visit shortly.
Mr. David Davis.
The Chief Executive Officer of Capita says they'll lose a lot of money on their recruitment contract on behalf of the MOD. In that case, presumably, the government have got a strong legal case for simply terminating the contract without compensation and taking it back in-house and doing it properly.
Well, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has certainly made clear that he has not ruled out the option of terminating the contract. However, in recent months, we have seen dramatic improvements in the performance of that contract, partly because of the money that Capita have put in their own money into ensuring that that's the case.
Mr. Speaker, in my hometown of Tain in the Highlands, we have every year the very splendid Tain Highland Gathering. It's been a good number of years, Mr. Speaker, since I've seen any armed forces recruiting stands at the Highland Games. These stands have been very successful in the past, and the children and young people love them. And frankly, as has already been said, Capita is not doing very well. Could I encourage the Minister and the Secretary to get these stands set up again? And in my own case, the people there will be rewarded by a very large glass of our local amber nectar, Glenmorangie.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable member for highlighting the recruiting opportunity. I sense that it sounds as if I might be coming for a visit myself, given what's on offer. But it's a very sensible suggestion. I will ensure that that is fed into the system.
Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the size of the army is in free fall under this Conservative government. The number of fully trained regulars has fallen from 78,000 to 75,900 on this minister's watch. His colleague, the Minister for Defence People, is reported to have said that he will resign if that number falls below 70,000. So what about the Minister for the Armed Forces? Is he prepared to make that same commitment?
Well, I'm certainly not prepared to resign in my role as a member of the Army Reserve, because that wouldn't really help matters, would it? But actually, I think the honourable lady rather over-eggs the pudding slightly to describe it as being in free fall. Yes, numbers have reduced, but we've already explained why, with now the highest number of applications on record in January, that we are confident that numbers will increase. But crucially, actually, the Army, for example, remains at 93% manning and can meet all of its operational commitments.
Neil Griffith.
Well, doesn't that say it all, Mr. Speaker? He doesn't even have the courage to put his job on the line. Now, time and time again, he comes here and bluffs his way through with empty rhetoric. But the simple fact is that he's failed completely, and army numbers are falling month after month. At best, he is complacent. At worst, he has junked the stated target of 82,000 and not got the guts to tell us. When is he going to accept that it is his responsibility to end this failure and get a grip?
Well, I've been accused of many things in my life, but lacking courage is probably not one of them. If the Honourable Lady knew anything about me, she'd probably realise why that's the case. But nonetheless, it is and still remains a challenge, and I am confident after recent figures where, as I've just said, we've seen the highest number of applications in January on record, that actually the situation is improving.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK defence industry is globally competitive and creates and contributes to jobs across the United Kingdom. I am confident that that will continue to thrive in the future. The Government is seeking the best possible deal for UK industry after exit. We support European collaboration on capability development and are promoting the invaluable contribution of UK industry.
John Speller.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that was a standard complacent reply from the Minister, because at a time when ministers are still hanging on to the mythology that EU regulations prevent them from supporting British industry, most recently with the Fleet Solid support ships. Though, of course, no one else in the EU actually holds on to that view or indeed behaves like that. However, as leaving the EU is looming, will the Minister now show some decisiveness and backbone, instruct his officials to scrap the old discredited dogma and start putting British industry first?
Yeah. What I say to the right honourable gentleman is that what we're trying to do is make our defence industry the most competitive in the world, so that we win those international competitions. Now, it's not right, it wouldn't be right for me to comment on the decisions taken by other countries, as he referred to with FSS, but I might just note, however, that the EU Commission has publicly questioned the legality of applying Article 346 to the procurement of support ships by other member states. So I'm glad that we've behaved properly.
David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, could the Minister confirm that even after we've left the EU, we will continue to have members of the British Armed Forces based in EU countries contributing towards the defence of those countries, and that therefore it's not unreasonable for us to expect their governments to support the British defence industry and the British government as we finalise negotiations with the rest of the European Union?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very valid point, and of course our commitment to EU security, European security, and working with our NATO colleagues will continue after we've left the European Union. That's why we're working on an ambitious future arrangement, because people know that the armed forces of the United Kingdom are armed forces they can rely on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister knows that I'm a huge advocate of the combat air strategy and in fact had the first debate in here. Given we are about to leave the EU and Team Tempest is so far showing impressive signs of movement, can he tell me when we're going to discuss a replacement for the Hawk, so we have a full package and a training aircraft and to secure the jobs at Brough?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right about the future combat air strategy. We're in negotiations and discussions with other partner nations. When it comes to the issues around Hawk, I have to say we've been doing an enormous amount of work to try and get more orders for the Brough site. I recognise how important it is. Having visited Q8 myself to try and get that order over the line, it's still work in progress, but I hope that we'll be successful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, one of the ways that we could encourage the UK defence industry is using new and emerging technologies. So could my honourable friend comment on the use of the Transformation Fund, in particular the £30 million given for new military apps and the £66 million for robotic programmes that will encourage the UK industry to develop further?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. I went to see some of the small and medium-sized businesses who are working with our armed forces with some of the projects that have been funded through that, and plus the Innovation Fund, of course, the £800 million over 10 years, which is encouraging as many businesses as possible to come forward with their ideas, many of whom have probably never worked with defence in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we saw the ceremony for confirming the move of the EU anti-piracy task force from Northwood to a new location near Cadiz. Now, all around us we are hearing about the consequences of Brexit on the defence industry, but on our security relationships. Yet, despite there being rather uncommon consensus in the House about the importance of that relationship, we've heard precious little from the Department. Now, not only our closest allies, but in defence industry, serving personnel and policymakers need clarity on the UK's grand strategy. So can the Minister stop hedging their bets and tell us about the defence and security relationship his government wants with the EU?
Well, part of the negotiations that have been happening with the EU have actually heavily focused on our future relationship and the collaboration that we want to see with EU nations. But at the end of the day, most of our, the sort of cornerstone of our defence is actually through NATO, and it is through those relationships and with the bilateral relationships we have with many of our other countries that will form the way that we do defence in the future.
Gerald Jones.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the party opposite play political games and the Cabinet seeks to oust the Prime Minister, the huge uncertainty for our defence industry continues. The Prime Minister's Brexit deal has been rejected twice, so will the Minister accept that the Government must now do the responsible thing and work across the House to build a consensus for a better deal? And instead of treating this House with yet more disdain, will he confirm that the Government will work with MPs from across the House to determine the course of action?
I'll just gently say this is defence questions. The Prime Minister will be making a statement shortly. Maybe that question would have to be heard.
Floor, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, may I pair this with question 11, 12, 19 and 23? I'm sure they're all very genuine. But it is a genuine subject because this is about the support we provide our veterans. And we owe our veterans a huge debt of gratitude. But it's important that that gratitude is reflected in the practical support that we provide. And that's exactly why we're investing in a new veterans strategy, which will be fundamental to improving the coordination of that support.
Yes, it has been gently pointed out to me, not that one wishes to be pedantic, merely correct, that one might not be able to pair something, particularly when there are four, but a grouping, on the other hand, is perfectly orderly. We're extremely grateful. Hugh Merriman. Mr. Merriman, let's hear it, man.
No, we're waiting for you to finish, Mr. Speaker. I know my place. Thank the Minister for his answer. With regard to the amazing role that the charity sector provides to enhance veteran support, what engagement has the Minister had with that sector?
Minister. Well, I'm grateful for that question from my honourable friend. It's so important that we engage as much and as best as possible as we can. There are over 400 service-facing charities, and the coordination is done by the Veterans Gateway and indeed COBSIO as well, who form themselves into the clusters so we can provide the necessary support in the various areas that are required. But I'd go on to say, Mr. Speaker, that on a regular basis, myself and the Defence Secretary meet up in the MOD every second Monday to meet with the charitable sectors, and the next coming weeks we'll be meeting charities specifically based in the arts.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, a monthly drop-in service has been established at Crawley Library for veterans to get advice on services supported by the Royal British Legion and SAFA, amongst others. Can I get a commitment from the Ministry of Defence that they will continue to work with the voluntary sector who provide such fantastic support?
I'm grateful for my honourable friend in the same way that my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, underlined the importance of these very locally, geographically based charities. It's so important that the message gets out that support is available to the veterans. The biggest challenge we face is actually the veterans not aware of where to go, where help can actually be found. So I'm very grateful for the work that's done in his constituency.
Hardy.
Mr. Speaker, veterans in Hull are very fortunate to have the support of incredible people like Steve from Hull Veterans Support Centre and Paul from Hull for Heroes. There is an ambitious plan to build a veterans village in Hull, so will the Minister meet with me to discuss the best way he can support this?
I'm always delighted to meet honourable members who want to pursue and support the veterans' initiatives, and I certainly pay credit and provide support. I'd be delighted to visit. I have to say my mother-in-law lives just down the road from Hull in Beverley, so maybe I can tie in the two visits in one go.
Yes. Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60,000 armed forces veterans are currently either suffering with mental health problems, are in prison, or are finding themselves homeless. What more support can be given to personnel as they leave the armed forces to help reduce these numbers in the future?
My honourable friend is right to focus on specific issues where we do need to increase our support. One of the reasons why we're actually putting together the veterans strategy is to actually understand where we can do more. And the prison sector is one area, but also the transition process that she touched on. It's so important that as those depart the armed forces, they know where help can actually be provided. We are now getting back in touch with armed forces personnel and their families 12 months after they've departed to check on their progress.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ubitech in my constituency is a business made up completely of ex-service people. It's expanding fast and they provide services to the MOD and others. They also provide resettlement training and they're a support of the Armed Forces Covenant. So given that, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree that it's not surprising that they regard the decision to prosecute Soldier F after 47 years with absolute dismay? So what does the Minister, how can the Minister respond to that?
Well, that is for the Northern Ireland Prosecution Service made an independent judgment on that. I think it would be wrong for us to make any judgment on this side, but I would say what she illustrates there is another great example of veterans charities doing fantastic work on a local basis. And if there's an opportunity to visit her constituency, I'll be delighted to meet.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, on return from his tour of Afghanistan in 2007, my constituent Robert Duncan experienced PTSD. It's taken this long to have a conversation, that's all he wants, with those under whom he served. Why can't he have that conversation?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know the circumstances of the particular case, and I'd be delighted to meet with her to see what more can be done. We are now, as I touched on before, actually far more engaged with the individuals of every service personnel that served in Afghanistan and Iraq to track the very progress, to make sure that we're in touch and give them the support that they need. But if there is a case for an individual to be looked at again, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, whilst we know that the charity sector is doing a great deal of work and we're extremely grateful for that, there is an absence of veterans-focused policies in areas such as welfare and employability. The transition to civilian life can be difficult. So does the Minister agree that the government must be doing more in this area?
I'm pleased to say that she mentioned government must be doing more, and I would actually say that's absolutely correct. The Veterans Board was established for exactly this mission, to make sure it's not just the MOD that does its bit, but all government departments recognise their duty to honour the covenant, to make sure that they provide the support that we need to give our brave veterans.
Michael Fabricant.
Question 5, sir.
That's not me.
Thank you. Gentleman's pardon. Mr. Hamilton wanted to come in on this question. Yeah. Well, whether we like him, well, we do like him, but whether we like him or not, he's got a right to be heard. Mr. Fabian Hamilton.
The honourable member for intervening before he had the chance to ask his question. Mr. Speaker, thank you. Defence questions on the 18th of February. I asked the Minister about the Black Soldiers of the East Africa Force, formed in 1940, after an investigation revealed that they were only paid a third of the wage received by their white counterparts. Now, on the 13th of February, Her Majesty's opposition wrote to the government about this issue, and I wrote myself to the Minister on the 28th of February, but so far no replies have been received. The Foreign Office claims that this is a matter for the Ministry of Defence. But the Minister told the House last month that this was a matter for the Foreign Office. So can the Minister please confirm that it is in fact his department's responsibility? And may I ask him again when the East Africa Force veterans and their families might expect at the very least an official apology and compensation for this scandal?
Perhaps it does feel like we're living an episode of Yes, Minister, and I fully understand that, with departments trying to establish who has responsibility. We do need to iron that out, and absolutely we need to get the answers that he deserves. Perhaps I can speak with him afterwards, and then we can move this issue forward.
Question 5 again, sir.
Armed Forces careers are built on merit, creating an environment where potential is defined by effort, talent, and not by background. The skills, education and training that they get in the armed forces give many people the chance to achieve so much, not just while they serve, but also when they leave.
With the appointment of Brigadier Janice Cook to DMS, that's Defence Medical Services in Lichfield, as head of regulation there, and of course the very recent appointment of Sue Gray as Air Marshal, does this not demonstrate that there is no glass ceiling for women in the armed forces?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to say that there is no glass ceiling, and he brings out two brilliant examples of where women in our armed forces can achieve so much and make such a difference. We all recognise we need to get more women joining all three services. The contribution and the value that they bring is enormous, and the opening up of all roles, including close combat roles, has been vitally important in doing so.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State must know that one of the greatest players in social mobility, encouraging social mobility and equal opportunity, was the British Armed Services when they were the greatest trainers in Britain in terms of quality and in size and capacity. When is he going to go back to that mission of having a real training programme in the Army that is big, not tiny?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very strong point of maybe expanding our armed forces more than they are. But we should feel proud of the fact that we're the largest employer of apprentices in this country, with 19,000 service personnel currently receiving apprenticeships. And we recognise that the value that we're able to bring in terms of apprenticeships, and the fact that we continue to lead on this. And the value they bring isn't just to the service that they're in, but is the contribution to wider society as they often pursue a second career after they leave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Secretary of State once again for retaining 40 Commando in Taunton. It's a momentous decision and great for Taunton. But can I also say that only 9% of British soldiers are female, and does he agree with me that opening all combat roles to women will make a real difference to our armed forces going forward? And I look forward to the first ones joining the Marines.
If I may pay tribute to my honourable friend who did so much in terms of her campaign to keep the Royal Marines in Taunton and the important role they play in the local community, I'm very much looking forward to the first female recruits into the Royal Marines, and I'm sure they'll be welcomed by the whole corps.
In towns like St Helens and Newton Willows, the armed forces have always been a driver of social mobility and of civic pride. But like many places, we have lost our armed forces careers office. Would he consider reopening not just that, but in many working class communities across the country upon whom the armed forces rely for their recruitment?
One of the key drivers in terms of recruitment now is increasingly online, but we need to always be looking at how we reach out into local communities. I remember at my school, where I was growing up in Scarborough, the fact that the Green Howards so often used to visit, sending out the message of what an army career would able to deliver. And we need to be looking at how we bring service personnel right into the community recruiting.
Number 6, sir.
The prosecution of veterans is something that we take very seriously. Our service personnel are, of course, subject to the law, but veterans should not have to face repeated investigations many years after the events in question. This is why we have a dedicated defence team looking at this complex issue. A statute of limitations which presents significant challenges is the subject of inquiry by the Defence Committee, and we await their report with interest.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I met Field Marshal the Lord Bramall, former head of the Armed Forces, who is one of my constituents, recently. And since last year, when so many of my constituents signed the petition on this issue, how is my right honourable and gallant friend ensuring that the political context of the Troubles, which Lord Bramall's book, The Bramall Papers, describes, is taken into account in today's politically motivated witch hunts?
Well, as Chief of General Staff and then Chief of Defence Staff during the height of the Troubles, Lord Bramwell clearly brings a unique perspective to these difficult issues. The House will, of course, understand that prosecutorial decisions in Northern Ireland are taken by the Public Prosecution Service and that the PPS is independent both of the UK Government and the Northern Ireland Executive. But the Government does recognise that the current system for dealing with the legacy of Northern Ireland's past isn't working well for anyone. And that is why the MOD is working closely with the Northern Ireland Office on new arrangements, including to ensure that our armed forces and police officers are not unfairly treated.
Members of the Defence Committee have been very pleased by the way in which ministers have set up the dedicated unit to look into this question, and also by the work that the Attorney-General has been doing on it as well. Can we be told whether the proposals that are apparently going to be brought forward in the Queen's speech have yet been finalised and accepted at Cabinet level?
Minister. My right honourable friend highlights, as he understands, the complexities of this issue, not least as it transcends not just Northern Ireland but different judicial systems elsewhere within the United Kingdom. We are making progress on this issue. We certainly have applied to bring it forward in the Queen's speech, but we have yet to conclude this work.
Danielle Rowley.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, if I can muster this question with question 16 and 17. The Armed Forces Covenant not only obliges government departments to recognise their duties to support armed forces personnel, veterans and their families, but it also encourages organisations, businesses across the country to do the same. And I'm pleased to say that we're now over 3,300 signings, and we're signing around 25 companies or organisations each week.
Danielle Rowley.
A recent Defence Committee report said some serving personnel, veterans and their families who need mental health care are still being completely failed by the system. We've heard about engagement with charities and mental health support, but a local charity doing great work in Midlothian, the Lothian Veterans Centre, have confirmed this sentiment from the committee's report and told me that charities face a huge burden and huge pressures in helping veterans. What is the government doing to encourage service personnel to report mental health problems without fear of reprisal and to ensure that there is greater focus on mental health provision?
She packs a lot into one question there, and very, very important indeed. The critical aspect is the change of stigma, is the ability to step forward and say, yes, I'm not okay, and not feel that there will be reprisals. And thanks to the new mental health and wellbeing strategy of 2017, we're doing exactly that. It's taking a while to change the culture, but absolutely more people are willing to step forward and say, let me get checked out, let me get sorted, let me get back into the line without fear that it might damage their promotion prospects.
Speaker, why should commercial organisations take this seriously when the Ministry of Defence hasn't yet managed to change its demand for British meat so that our armed forces can be fed the finest meat in the world?
Hear, hear. I understand this is an issue that dates back to a former armed forces minister's time many, many years ago when we were back in office a couple of decades ago. We discussed this ourselves. I'll certainly look at this, but I would encourage all those, despite their issues with meat, to absolutely sign the Armed Forces Covenant and support our brave veterans and armed forces personnel.
The acute care for armed forces personnel who've had acquired brain injuries in the course of their duties is really second to none. Nobody would doubt that. But the anxiety is that when they leave the armed forces, or sometimes even before they've come into the armed forces, an acquired brain injury goes unnoticed and therefore untreated and uncared for, which is why so many people end up, armed forces veterans, end up being homeless and living on the street. What are we going to do about that?
Minister. Well, firstly, can I pay tribute to the personal interest that he takes on this? He's absolutely right that people need to be signposted and know where to go. We're working more closely with NHS England and the devolved administrations to understand where the complex treatment services are and to make sure that when you do the transition, you are handed across to the civilian agency to look after you.
Trevelyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the founder of the all-party parliamentary group on the Armed Forces Covenant, it's wonderful to see an order paper full of those three words, which didn't exist a few years ago. So this is a conversation that is absolutely critical to this House. Would the Minister therefore meet with me to actually move forward the conversation about how we create an Armed Forces Covenant ombudsman, so that when these issues, which are raised by colleagues, get stuck and we can't find a solution, we have a real authority to fix it?
Well, firstly, could I pay tribute to the work that she's done as Chair of the Armed Forces, as the APPG on this important issue? I'm more than delighted to meet with her. It is important that we have the necessary scrutiny that's seen to be in place and that we do what's best for our veterans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for his answer to the question posed by my honourable friend, the member for Midlothian. But when 0.01% of the NHS budget is spent on veterans' mental health care, doesn't he agree that we've got a lot further to go in this area? And will he at least endorse fully the recommendations made by the Defence Select Committee on this issue?
Well, I was delighted to address the Defence Select Committee only the other day on this matter to discuss it, and absolutely we need to follow the money. We're aware that £21 billion was given to the NHS over the next 10 years, of which a proportion of that will go to mental health. The Prime Minister herself wants to see parity between mental health and physical health, medical well-being and physical well-being. So let's make sure that we can identify where that funds are. I hope to have a meeting, or the Defence Secretary will have a meeting with the Health Secretary as soon as possible to see what more can be done.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 8.
Minister.
The Army continues to work closely with Capita, with multiple interventions now in place and delivering improvements. Regular soldier applications remain at a 5-year high, with this year's Your Army Needs You advertising campaign seeing over 15,000 applications in January alone. It will take longer to see increases to training strengths due to the length of the recruitment and training pipeline.
Liz Twist.
The Secretary of State has said that he might re-examine the Capita contract in the next financial year, meaning that we'll have to wait another 12 months before any action is taken. All the while, Capita is failing abysmally, with Army numbers falling year after year. Instead of endlessly kicking the can down the road, why doesn't the government deal with the problem now, strip Capita of the contract and bring the service back in-house?
Well, I answered that question earlier, and with respect to the Honourable Lady, she clearly didn't listen to the answer I just gave her, where applications are up, there's a start of a process. I think one of the confusions the House has is when we talk about trained strength, which is the number, 93% manned of the Army. That is after a very long process of going through not only basic training, but, for example, if you are a Royal Engineer, also combat engineer training, and then trade training. So it can take up to 18 months from the first time somebody puts a uniform on and considers themselves to be part of the Army. When you're in training, you don't go home and say, I'm not in the Army because I'm not fully trade trained yet. And there are some 5,000 soldiers now in that process who are wearing a uniform but not included in the numbers. And in time, they will join the Army, and we're seeing that uplift. It's the time lag, which I think this House isn't fully understanding, but I understand why.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, in terms of the effectiveness of recruitment, my right honourable friend will know that we recruit many Armed Forces servicemen and women from the Commonwealth. But is he aware of the Royal British Legion campaign to eliminate the current high costs of their applications for indefinite leave to remain, to which they're eligible after 4 years' service? This can cost almost £10,000 for a family of 4. And does my right honourable friend agree that it is time that this issue was tackled in order that we recruit more from the Commonwealth?
My honourable friend raises a very important issue, and I know that my right honourable friend is engaging with the Home Office in an attempt to solve it.
Evan Foster.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
The security situation on the Korean Peninsula has improved since North Korea adopted a self-imposed moratorium on missile launches. North Korea almost certainly wishes to avoid conflict. However, the balance of hard military power on the peninsula has not altered substantively recently. North Korea needs to engage in meaningful negotiations with the United States and take concrete steps towards complete denuclearisation.
Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his answer. The failure of recent talks aimed at securing denuclearisation in North Korea was disappointing, though I welcome South Korea's attempt to revive them. Would my right honourable friend assure me the UK government's support for any agreement reached in future would be dependent on a commitment by North Korea to complete denuclearisation?
You're in the groove.
We have been absolutely consistent that there has to be complete denuclearisation. And while it's disappointing as to where talks have gone, we must remain hopeful that pressure can be applied for North Korea to come back to the table in order to be able to reinvigorate these discussions going forward.
Gapes. Mr. Speaker, can the government make clear that North Korea cannot play games like it has done for more than 20 years and that just want to get sanctions lifted or economic support from outside and then revert back to its old policies? And there will be consequences internationally if they do that.
The honourable gentleman makes an important point, and I remember visiting South Korea with him back, I think, in 2010 and 2011, where we looked at this. And it's vital that Britain stands shoulder to shoulder with our UN friends in terms of the imposition and the enforcement of sanctions, which the Royal Navy has been leading on with our other UN partners.
Is or is not North Korea degrading its nuclear capability?
We continue to monitor as to what is happening in North Korea. It's vitally important that we work with other allies, including the People's Republic of China, to put pressure on North Korea in order to reduce the amount of activity that they've been in the past conducting in terms of nuclear testing.
Millennium.
Number 10.
Mr. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence's first priority is always to guarantee the UK is able to meet its national security obligations, which includes ensuring our air defence radars can operate effectively. The Ministry of Defence is supportive of the offshore wind sector deal, and we remain keen to work closely across government and with industry to support this.
Over half the new offshore wind sites that the government's announced it will build will affect aviation radar systems. And his colleague responded to a written question of mine on the 20th of February saying that a solution is challenging and requires upgraded or new technologies which are not currently part of the equipment programme. Doesn't that simply mean that the government's ability to deliver on that sector deal is going to be hampered?
The Honourable Lady is raising a very important point because, of course, the scale and size of the wind farms that are proposed is significant. I have been speaking with officials about how we might use the Innovation Fund, for example, to work closely with industry to find a solution to this problem.
Neil Parish.
Mr. Speaker, in 2017, the UK won defence orders worth £9 billion, making us the second largest global defence exporter. We work actively with the Department for International Trade to support industry, and recent successes include export of the Type 26 to Canada and Australia, and of course the US Department of Defence awarding a further £500 million worth of support work for the F-35 programme in North Wales.
Supercat, the leading specialist in design and development of high-mobility vehicles, defence vehicles, is located in my constituency. If they win a contract in Denmark, they have to offset 60% of that work in Denmark with supplying those vehicles to the Danish government. Yet, this is not something that we do here. Will the Minister meet with Supercat to discuss what more can be done to make sure we secure high-skilled defence jobs in this country when defence contracts are lost to foreign companies?
Well, of course, I'd be more than happy to meet the company in his constituency and with himself, of course. The UK and many of our closest international defence partners do not use offset because they can distort the market and lead to reduced value for money. We do look at alternative ways to encourage more inward investment. That's why we're working closely with Boeing and Lockheed Martin. And, of course, on the Boxer programme, we're aiming for 60% of that programme to be undertaken in the UK.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it was a pleasure to see the Minister in Glasgow on Friday for the naming of HMS Tamar, which, of course, when it was ordered, was classified as a complex warship, but now under the National Shipbuilding Strategy it's no longer considered to be a complex warship. So that bizarre situation aside, given the precarious situation faced by numerous British shipbuilders such as Harland and Wolff, which is facing administration, further job losses at Rosyth and of course the closure of Appledore shipyard, what will the government be doing to ensure that the Fleet Solid Support Ships contract and the consideration of that bid is weighted so that the UK economic prosperity consideration is factored into the weighting of that award for that contract, so the UK consortium will prevail?
Well, it was a pleasure to see the honourable gentleman in Glasgow. It was a great event. I was very happy to be there. He will know that we are trying, as I said earlier, to make UK industry as competitive as possible, and that is why we are putting this out to international competition, because of the description that it has not being a warship. That said, I am delighted that there is a Team UK, a consortium of UK shipbuilders is bidding into that competition, and there will also be lots of opportunities for the supply chain, who have also benefited from other competitions that went internationally, such as the Mars ships.
Norman Lamb.
15, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When defence equipment becomes surplus to requirement, the Defence Equipment Sales Authority disposes of it using compliant contractors or by direct sale to other governments. Contractors who process, store or dispose of sensitive defence equipment are subject to very strict ongoing security assurance programme.
Norman Lamb.
The Minister will be aware of very serious allegations that relate to the transportation and storage from Leonardo of defence technology by UEA&S in my constituency. When MOD police visited my constituents, they were told that prosecutions were likely to follow and that they would receive a copy of the investigation report. They're still waiting. Every request I've made for a meeting with ministers has been turned down for over a year now. Will the Minister now meet with me, and will he give me a copy of the report? Because there are serious concerns that there's a cover-up going on here.
I can say to the honourable gentleman that actually there have been inspections on site at the premises he's talking about. There was nothing there that was seen to be of concern. However, I completely understand the issues that this is causing for his constituents, and I'd be more than happy to meet with him and them.
Oh, well, the honourable gentleman is, I suspect, imploring me. And I want to hear from the honourable gentleman for Tewkesbury, who's been sitting patiently in his usual statesman-like fashion. So we'll hear from the fellow. Mr. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 18.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence spent £18.9 billion with UK industry in 2017-18, which supported 115,000 jobs directly across the country.
Mr. Lawrence Robertson.
I thank the Minister for that response. We'll be aware that one of the world's largest propeller manufacturers, Doughty Propellers, had a very unfortunate fire in my constituency 4 years ago. Owned by an American company, GE Aviation, they could have rebuilt that factory anywhere, but they've chosen to build it in my constituency, in this country, thereby securing 350 jobs. So can I thank the government for their contribution through the digital propulsion scheme, which will certainly contribute to the success of that company.
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend for the work that he's done in this area, and very much welcome the fact that GE Aviation's investment is creating this new propeller facility. I know that that will continue to contribute to the massive contribution that the defence industry plays in the southwest of the UK, and it will continue to provide the jobs that many people rely on.
Order. Topical questions. West Streeting.
Speaker, topical number 1.
In this, the 50th year of a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent, the MOD is proud to continue to protect the security and stability of our nation, but also of our allies. I'll be attending the service of commemoration at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of May. I hope many colleagues on both sides of the House will also be able to commemorate this important milestone.
West Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to the Defence Secretary's speech to Russia on the 11th of February, particularly the Defence Secretary's remark about the deployment of the Queen Elizabeth to the South China Sea, George Osborne described the speech as a throwback to an era of gunboat diplomacy. Lord Danett described the Secretary of State's speech in the context of wanting to use defence as a platform to develop his own career. Could he take this opportunity to explain exactly what he means by that deployment and whether he's managed to have a discussion with the Chancellor about the finer points of international diplomacy and trade?
Well, as I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman will be aware, we're the second largest investor in the Southeast Asia region. We have strong and many deep allies in terms of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and of course the United States. So it's perfectly natural that we'll continue to operate and exercise alongside our allies. That is what is normal and what would be expected.
How does my right honourable friend score his department on their agreement with the Treasury to disperse of land now considered requirement to needs for the MOD and to release that land for the housing market?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that we need to release that land. 2% of Britain is actually owned by the MOD. It's now surplus to requirements. It's important that we have a programme of disbursement which works with local communities so we can free up that land for important housing.
Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the entire House was disturbed yesterday to hear reports in the press of injuries sustained by UK Special Forces in Yemen, and I'm sure the entire House would join me in wishing them a speedy recovery. I appreciate that the MOD does not comment on Special Forces operations, but this news certainly illustrates, Mr. Speaker, the engagement that UK forces now have in that part of the Arabian Peninsula. So will the Secretary of State now make a statement to the House and to ensure that we and our constituents can know more about the UK's ongoing role in that desperate and devastating conflict?
As the honourable gentleman knows, we neither confirm nor deny the use of our special forces.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, very much. As a proud member of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, I've been so privileged to visit a number of servicemen and women around the world. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that this is a fantastic career for women as well as men? And can he update me on what more he's doing to encourage more women to join our armed services?
Well, as was touched upon earlier, we're very much showing and leading by example with the promotion of many women into some of the highest roles within both the Army, Navy and, of course, the Royal Air Force as well. But what we've been looking at is how we do our advertising, how we do the reach out to encourage more women to understand there is a very positive career to play in terms of our armed forces.
Mr. Speaker, normally it takes 3 years to train an RAF pilot. Will the Minister explain why it is now taking up to 7 years?
Mr. Speaker, we accept that there have been issues with this contract, absolutely, but we are working very closely with industry at the moment to try and resolve that to make sure that there are those training facilities that are needed for the people that want to take up that career.
Another question. The honourable gentleman wants another one. Wayne David, very well.
Mr. Speaker, well, we had a very interesting response from the Minister, but isn't it the case that there is this problem because there are shortages of planes and instructors, and things are so bad that the MOD are paying a private contractor for phantom courses that never take place? On current estimates, it will take another 20 years before the RAF has enough pilots. So how does the Minister propose to remedy this totally unacceptable situation?
Well, as I said to the honourable gentleman a moment ago, I have met with industry recently. I have spoken to, for example, the Chief Executive of BAE Systems. I want those industries to work together to come up with a solution. That's the challenge we're giving them.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Having hitherto restrained EU military ambition, why are we now seeking to be its vanguard?
Well, of course, the reality is that NATO is the cornerstone of our defence, and whilst we have participated in past in EU missions such as Op Atlanta or Op Althea, we will only do so if it's in our national interest in the future.
very much, Mr. Speaker. Our defence manufacturers are based in every corner of this country, many of them providing vital contribution to local and regional economies. But SMEs have said to me they feel disadvantaged because they can't get down to London for many of the procurement briefings that take place. Will the Minister crack open the gates of Whitehall, get his civil servants out around the country to see the brilliant work by manufacturers across our country?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and that is exactly what we're doing. I was very pleased to host an SME forum myself in Belfast. The next one will be in Wales, but we have officials all over the country engaging with SMEs because we recognise that there's a massive contribution that they can make to the defence needs of this country.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In England, 1 in 6 people report experience a common mental health problem in any given week. Within both the military and serving veteran communities, there exists the additional stigma which prevents individuals seeking help. What steps is the Department doing to reduce the stigma and support military charities such as the RAF Association, who are actively supporting these individuals?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend touches on such an important issue that is critical if we are to retain people in the armed forces. We need to provide the necessary support when it comes to these mental health issues. As the Prime Minister herself has said, she wants to see parity between mental and physical health, and that's exactly what the 2017 mental health strategy seeks to secure.
Ronnie Cowan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a reply to a recent written question, I was told the United Kingdom government can only deploy armed military forces on UK soil at the request, for example, the appropriate police force. Has a response to such a request been considered as part of post-Brexit contingency plans?
We always have had long-established military assistance to civilian authorities rules, and local authorities, police authorities and all government departments understand that, and we always respond in any way we can do to support and help.
A very senior parliamentary celebrity, Sir Edward Lee.
If RAF Scampton is to close, which the whole people of Lincolnshire naturally oppose, in deciding where the red arrows should go, will the Secretary of State bear in mind that we have 3 excellent airfields, Waddington, Coningsby and Cranwell, and above all, wonderful airspace, and we should not move the red arrows to an inferior county like Yorkshire?
I very much appreciate the strong campaigning that my right honourable friend has been undertaking in terms of keeping the red arrows in Lincolnshire, and will certainly be listening very closely to all arguments.
Eric Glendon!
Speaker, our satisfaction with pay...
Order. I understand the air of excitement and anticipation of important matters, but the question from the Honourable Lady, the member for North Tyneside, is important and must be heard. Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our satisfaction with pay and pension benefits is at its lowest levels ever recorded. Does the Minister accept that 7 years of below inflation pay rises have had a severe effect on the morale of our armed forces?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we take the continuous attitude survey very seriously. We are concerned that there has been a fall in morale. I'm pleased to see the Chancellor is in his place, and I hope he'll recognise that when the spending review comes round for allocation.
Speaker, in our spend on defence, it's important that our armed forces get the best, and in respect of naval propulsion systems, that means the low vibration motors produced by GE Energy in Rugby. Does the Minister agree it's important to maintain that capability in the UK?
Well, I know that this is an issue that my honourable friend has raised a number of times, and myself and the Minister for Defence Procurement have also met with him. We're working very closely with GE to do everything we can do to support the business going forward, including the enormous work that's been put into securing export orders as well.
Anna Soubry!
Mr. Speaker, nobody in Broxtowe wants the British Army to leave Chetwynd Barracks, especially as we're so proud of our association with the Sappers, the Royal Engineers. But we understand that the land must be sold off. What we are concerned about is the delay in the sale, and I'd be grateful if the Minister would be agreeable to a meeting so that we can see how we can best dispose of the land for housing.
Minister Elwood.
I'd be delighted to meet my honourable friend in order to discuss this. I know she's been passionate about this particular issue, and we'll see whether we can resolve the matter.
Order. We must now move on. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Thank you. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on last week's European Council. Before the Council, I wrote to President Tusk to seek formal approval for the legally binding assurances on the Northern Ireland backstop and alternative arrangements agreed in Strasbourg on the 11th of March. I reported your statement, Mr. Speaker, which made clear that for a further meaningful vote to take place, the deal would have to be fundamentally different, not different in terms of wording, but different in terms of substance. I explained that as a result, some honourable and right honourable members were seeking further changes to the withdrawal agreement, and I requested a short extension to the Article 50 process to the 30th of June. I regret having to do so. I wanted to deliver Brexit on the 29th of March, but I'm conscious of my duties as Prime Minister to all parts of our United Kingdom and of the damage that union leaving without a deal could do when one part of it is without devolved government and unable, therefore, to prepare properly. The Council formally endorsed the legal instrument relating to the withdrawal agreement and the joint statement supplementing the political declaration. This should increase the confidence of the House that the backstop is unlikely ever to be used and would only be temporary if it is. But the Council also reiterated, once again, its long-standing position that there could be no reopening of the withdrawal agreement. So however the House decides to proceed this week, everyone should be absolutely clear that changing the withdrawal agreement is simply not an option. Turning to extending Article 50, this has always required the unanimous agreement of the other 27 member states. As I've made clear before, it was never guaranteed that the EU would agree to an extension or the terms on which we requested it, and they did not. Instead, the Council agreed that if the House approves the withdrawal agreement this week, our departure will be extended to 11 p.m. on the 22nd of May. This will allow time for Parliament to pass the withdrawal agreement bill, which is legally necessary for the deal to be ratified. But if the House does not approve the withdrawal agreement this week, our departure will instead be extended only to 11 p.m. on the 12th of April. At this point, we would either leave with no deal, or we would indicate a way forward before this date for consideration by the European Council. If this involved a further extension, it would certainly mean participation in the European parliamentary elections. The Council's conclusions were subsequently turned into a legal decision, with which the UK agreed and which came into force last Friday. So while the Government has today laid a statutory instrument, which will be debated later this week, to reflect this in our domestic legislation, the date for our departure from the EU has now changed in international law. Were the House not to pass the statutory instrument, it would cause legal confusion and damaging uncertainty, but it would not have any effect on the date of our exit. Mr. Speaker, I continue to believe that the right path forward is for the United Kingdom to leave the EU as soon as possible with a deal, now on the 22nd of May. But it is with great regret that I have had to conclude that as things stand, there is still not sufficient support in the House to bring back the deal for a third meaningful vote. I continue to have discussions with colleagues across the House to build support so that we can bring the vote forward this week and guarantee Brexit. If we cannot, the Government made a commitment that we would work across the House to find a majority on a way forward. The amendment in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, seeks to provide for this process by taking control of the order paper. I continue to believe doing so would be an unwelcome precedent to set, which would overturn the balance of our democratic institutions. So the Government will oppose this amendment this evening, but in order to fulfil our commitments to this House, would seek to provide Government time in order for this process to proceed. It would be for this House to put forward options for consideration and to determine the procedure by which they wish to do so. But I must confess that I am sceptical about such a process of indicative votes. When we've tried this kind of thing in the past, it's produced contradictory outcomes or no outcome at all. There is a further risk when it comes to Brexit, as the UK is only one half of the equation, and the votes could lead to an outcome that is unnegotiable with the EU. No government could give No government could give a blank cheque to commit to an outcome without knowing what it is. So I cannot commit the government to delivering the outcome of any votes held by this House, but I do commit to engaging constructively with this process. There are many different views on the way forward. But I want to explain the options as I understand them. The default outcome continues to be to leave with no deal. But this House has previously expressed its opposition to that path and may very well do so again this week. The alternative is to pursue a different form of Brexit or a second referendum. But the bottom line remains. If the House does not approve the withdrawal agreement this week and is not prepared to countenance leaving without a deal, we will have to seek a longer extension. This would entail the UK having to hold European elections, and it would mean that we will not have been able to guarantee Brexit. These are now choices the House will have the opportunity to express its view on. Mr. Speaker, this is the first chance I've had to address the House since my remarks last Wednesday evening.
The House must calm itself. The Prime Minister is addressing the House and must be heard. And colleagues know from the record that they have a full opportunity to question the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister.
I express my frustration with our collective failure to take a decision. But I know that many members across this House are frustrated too, and we all have difficult jobs to do. People on all sides of the debate hold passionate views, and I respect those differences. I would also like to thank those colleagues, all of those colleagues that have supported the deal so far, and those that have taken the time to meet with me to discuss their concerns. I hope we can all agree we are now at the moment of decision, and in doing so we must confront the reality of the hard choices before us. Unless this House agrees to it, no deal will not happen. No Brexit must not happen, and a slow Brexit, which extends Article 50 beyond the 22nd of May, forces the British people to take part in European elections and gives up control of any of our borders, laws, money or trade, is not a Brexit that will bring the British people together. I know that the deal I've put forward is a compromise. It seeks to deliver on the referendum and retain trust in our democracy, while also respecting the concerns of those who voted to remain. But if this House can back it, we could be out of the European Union in less than 2 months. There will be no further extensions, no threat to Brexit, and no risk of a no deal. That, I believe, is the way to deliver the Brexit the British people voted for, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of the statement and for the meetings that we've had in recent days. Mr. Speaker, the government's approach to Brexit has now become a national embarrassment. After 2 years of failure, broken promises after broken promises, the Prime Minister finally accepted the inevitable last week and voted to extend Article 50 and went to Brussels to negotiate. Last week's summit represented another negotiating failure for the Prime Minister. Her proposals were rejected and new terms were imposed on her. We now have an extension until mid-April or May the 22nd. And despite the clearly expressed will of this House, we will still face the prospect of a disastrous no-deal Brexit. This is even more remarkable given that the Minister for the Cabinet Office told this very chamber, and I quote, "Seeking such a short and critically one-off extension would be, in his words, downright reckless." Mr. Speaker, this failure has been compounded by the Prime Minister's attempts last week to pin the blame for this debacle on others. It was wholly inappropriate last Wednesday for the Prime Minister to try and pit the people against MPs. MPs elected here doing their duty to hold the government of the day to account. That is what Parliament exists for. And in a climate of heightened emotions where MPs on all sides have received threats and intimidation, I hope the Prime Minister will further reflect and think again about making what I believe to be such dangerous and irresponsible statements. Every step of the way along this process, the government has refused to reach out, refused to listen and refused to find a consensus that can represent the views of the whole country, not just the Conservative Party. Large parts of our country continue to be ignored by this government. No wonder so many people felt compelled to march on the streets or sign petitions over the weekend. Even the most ardent of Leavers, Mr. Speaker, the most ardent of Leavers think this government has failed. It's easy to understand the frustration at this chaos. It exists in this House, in Brussels and across the country. The government has no plan. For them, it's all about putting the Conservative Party before the country. Given that the Prime Minister admitted she does not have the numbers for her deal, will she accept today that her deal is dead and that the House should not have its time wasted giving the same answer for a third time? But the Prime Minister has succeeded in unifying two sides against her deal. The CBI and the TUC's unprecedented joint statement last week demanded a Plan B which protects jobs, workers, industry and communities. Has the Prime Minister got a Plan B? No. The government has failed and let the people down, whether they voted leave or whether they voted remain. The country cannot continue to afford a Tory crisis. It's time, Mr. Speaker, for Parliament to take control. And that's why, later today, we will be backing the amendment in the name of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset. You made it clear last week, Mr. Speaker, that for the Prime Minister to bring a deal back, there must be significant changes. There are none. Rather than trying to engineer a way to bring back the same twice-rejected deal, will the Prime Minister instead allow, rather than fight plans for indicative votes? She cannot both accept her deal does not have the numbers and stand in the way of finding an alternative that may have the numbers. It is ridiculous to suggest that Parliament taking control is overturning democratic institutions. It's not, Mr. Speaker. It's Parliament doing its democratic job of holding government to account. So, Mr. Speaker, will she agree to abide by the outcome of these indicative votes if they take place on Wednesday? On behalf of the Labour Party, we will continue with cross-party discussions to find a way forward, and I thank those members who have met with colleagues of mine and myself to have these discussions. I believe there is support in this House for a deal based on an alternative that protects jobs, the economy through a customs union and full single market access, and allows us to continue the benefit from participation in vital agencies and security measures. If the government refuses to accept this, we will support measures for a public vote to stop a no-deal or chaotic Tory deal. The government has had over 2 years to find a solution and has failed. It's time, Mr. Speaker, we put an end to this and move on from the chaos and failure and begin to clean up the mess. It's time for Parliament to work together and agree on a Plan B. If she's brave, the Prime Minister would help facilitate for this. If not, Parliament must send a clear message in the coming days. Mr. Speaker, I hope where the government has failed, this House can and will succeed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the Right Honourable Gentleman indicates that we still face the he said we still face the prospect of no deal. The House has rejected no deal. As I said earlier, the House has rejected it. It's rejected, I think, twice now, and could very well continue to reject it. But the only way of actually putting that into practice is to support a deal. Now, he talks about reaching out. I have reached out to party leaders across this House and to other members of this House. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, have both held a number of meetings with members across this House and with party leaders. But the right honourable gentleman ended by saying that it is now time for the House to decide. But the point is that up till now the House has not decided. The House has had... Yet again, honourable members on the opposition benches say they haven't had a chance. The House has had many chances to put amendments down. The House has voted twice on the right honourable gentleman's plans for the future and rejected them. It has voted to reject no deal. It has also voted to reject a second referendum. He asked whether I was going to, whether the government would commit to abide by the indicative votes. I did, as the right honourable gentleman accepted, give him advance notice of my statement. I then read the statement. It did clearly say I cannot commit the government to delivering the outcome of any votes held by this House. And honourable members, well, the Shadow Foreign Secretary shouts that's not good enough. If she just thinks about this, for a moment, just thinks about this. First of all, we don't know what the options are going to be that will be tabled. Secondly, we don't know what will be selected. But there's another point. I think it is important that no one would want to support an option which contradicted the manifesto on which they stood for election to this House. And the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster obviously will be opening the debate this afternoon and will refer to the processes that are involved in the House. But the right honourable gentleman said it was important that MPs were elected here to make decisions. Yes, to take responsibility and to make decisions. But the MPs elected here to this House at this time have a duty to respect the result of the referendum that took place in 2016, and attempts to stop that result of that referendum being put into place, or attempts to change that result of that referendum, are not respecting the voters and not respecting our democracy. And then finally, the right honourable gentleman mentioned the fact that a number of people had marched on the question of a second referendum. Indeed.
Order. The House is in a very agitated state, but it's at an early stage in the proceedings. Calm. The Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman referred to the fact that a march for a second referendum took place. It is, in fact, the right honourable gentleman's policy. I noticed that his deputy went on the march. I thought the right honourable gentleman normally jumped at any opportunity to go on a march, but on this occasion he wasn't actually there. I can only assume on this occasion he was involved but not present.
Sir John Redwood.
Will the Prime Minister say to a Leave voter who wants us to leave on the 29th of March and thinks that indicative votes are a waste of time because, as she rightly says, the options on offer have already been rejected once or twice in this Parliament?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right that the options that appear to be on offer have already been rejected by this Parliament. I would have to point out, of course, that for reasons that I explained in my statement in relation particularly to the governance of part of the United Kingdom, we have requested the extension to Article 50, so that 29th of March date is no longer there. But I would say to a Leave voter, we can guarantee Brexit. We can guarantee Brexit and leaving on the 22nd of May by supporting, as the Council conclusion suggests, by supporting the deal that has been put forward. That is the way to guarantee Brexit. Anything else does not guarantee Brexit.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. Mr. Speaker, we are in a crisis, but one of the Prime Minister's own making. Her ill-judged speech before she departed for Brussels concluded that everyone's to blame but herself, trying to put herself on the side of the people and blaming parliamentarians. Mr. Speaker, it was Trump-esque. We don't need such raw populism at a time like this. It is truly flabbergasting. Will she now apologise for blaming parliamentarians the way that she did today? The Prime Minister needs to be reminded she's supposed to be leading a country. None on these benches think she can deliver. Her backbenchers don't think she can deliver. People right across the United Kingdom don't think she can deliver. Prime Minister, time is up. Mr. Speaker, today is about parliamentarians taking back control. People at home are watching and they are ashamed of this Parliament. ashamed of this government, ashamed of the embarrassment that British politics has become. Parliament today must move to find a consensus. We must come together and protect the interests of citizens across Scotland and all other parts of the United Kingdom. Members, we still have a choice. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Prime Minister, now with all sincerity, will she respect the will of Parliament and reject no deal? You know, when the Prime Minister is telling us that our votes don't count, at the same time Privy Councillors are being given briefings by her government, and those briefings are talking about the catastrophe and the real risks that there are to the United Kingdom, and it's the Prime Minister that is threatening the people of the United Kingdom with a no deal, and a no deal that this Parliament has already rejected. Mr. Speaker, what is the point of all of us sitting in this chamber and voting on debates, and the Prime Minister thinks she can ignore parliamentary sovereignty? What a disgrace! What an insult to this place! Because if our votes don't count, then frankly, we may as well just go home. If this House... Well, I'll tell you something, Mr. Speaker. If this Prime Minister is telling the people of Scotland that our votes don't count when we voted to remain, well, we know what the answer is. And the day is coming that the people of Scotland will vote for independence, and we will be an independent country in the European Union. So, will the Prime Minister tell us, do our votes count? Are they binding on the government, or is this just a puppet show? If that is the case, this is the greatest assault on democracy inflicted by any Prime Minister, and if members of Parliament are prepared to tolerate that, then shame on them. Shame on them. Mr. Speaker, Scotland will not be dragged out of the European Union by this Prime Minister. From the very beginning of this process, Scotland has been ignored, and now we learn that Parliament will once again be ignored. Mr. Speaker, at the weekend I was proud and privileged to take part in the historic march in London. I was proud to stand with the people alongside Scotland's First Minister and demand that the government listen to the people. And let me tell the Prime Minister this, she said that no deal is the alternative. Well, we on these benches will move revoke, because the Scottish parliamentarians have made sure that we have that power, and we will stop the Prime Minister driving us off a cliff edge. Over 1 million people marched to have the chance to vote again, to stop this chaos. Prime Minister, why are you not listening? Mr. Speaker, the PM must end this madness. Put it to the people. Let's have a people's vote.
I say to the right honourable gentleman, he was putting forward a number of proposals for the way forward in the speech that he has just given in response to my statement. There was one point at which he talked about Scotland voting to be an independent, would vote to become an independent country in the European Union. Of course, what was perfectly clear in the independence referendum in 2014, where Scotland rejected independence and decided to stay. Oh, the right honourable gentleman says, give it a rest. He stands up here proclaiming the benefits of democracy, and yet tells me to give it a rest when I point out that the people of Scotland voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. And he talks about coming together. This House has a duty to deliver Brexit. That means, I believe, delivering a Brexit with a deal that enables that smooth and orderly exit. And when he asked the question about whether his vote counts and votes in this House count, then of course votes in this House count. But so do the votes of 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The statutory instrument for extension of time was laid 1 hour ago. There is grave concern that there was no lawful UK authority for the decision on March the 22nd to extend the exit date. Did the Prime Minister seek the Attorney-General's advice beforehand, as clearly required by both the Ministerial Code and the Cabinet Manual, and will she publish that advice? And why did she not invoke the commencement order for Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act, repealing the European Communities Act 1972?
The Right Honourable Gentleman talks about the decision to extend Article 50. This House had supported an extension of Article 50. Yes, the Council took a different decision in relation to the length of time that that extension could take place for, but it was clear from this House, and people are saying to me, listen to this House and respect the House was clear that an extension of Article 50 should be sought, and an extension was agreed.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has told the House that if her withdrawal agreement is not approved by this Friday, then the extension we have been granted will only last until the 12th of April. If the Prime Minister currently does not intend to bring her deal back for another vote, she will then be faced with only two choices. Either doing nothing, in which case we will leave with no deal on the 12th of April, or applying for a further extension. Given the crisis that is facing our country, the public have a right to know which of those two options the Prime Minister intends to choose. Prime Minister, could you please tell us?
Right Honourable Gentleman is right that I said that as things stand, I did not believe there was support for bringing back a meaningful vote, but I also indicated that I was continuing to talk to colleagues across this House, and I would hope to be able to bring back a vote in this House that enables us to guarantee Brexit, because the one way of guaranteeing Brexit is to abide by the decision that was taken last week and ensure that we leave on the 22nd of May.
Mrs. Theresa May.
Prime Minister welcomed the comments of the Taoiseach over the weekend that he believes that there are special arrangements that could be put in place to maintain an invisible border on the island of Ireland, even in the event that the UK leaves without a deal.
We have, as my right honourable friend knows, and she's been involved in some of these discussions, been looking at the alternative arrangements that could be put in place, and further work is required. But I would also draw my right honourable friend's attention to, I believe, a release by the European Commission today in which they make clear that in all circumstances all EU laws would have to be abided by.
Mr. Vincent Cable.
Those of us who were among the million on Saturday naturally regret that both she and the Leader of the Opposition were too busy to join us. But can I ask, does she agree with the observation of her Chancellor that such a referendum would be a perfectly coherent proposition?
Well, gentlemen, I think virtually every time he stands up in either a statement or a speech, a debate where I'm opening a debate here in this House on this subject, tends to ask me about a second referendum. My view about a second referendum is very simple. I wasn't not on the march because I was too busy, as he says, but of course he and I hold a different opinion about a second referendum. I believe it's important for this House, rather than talking about and wanting to pass the decision back to the British people again, to actually say to the British people, we will abide by the instruction that you gave us in the referendum in 2016.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
The cost to the British people of the amount of money which will be payable under the deal that the Prime Minister has put forward is between £34 and £39 billion. What does the government estimate the cost to the United Kingdom of no deal?
Well, my right honourable friend asks an important question. We have published economic analysis which shows the impact of no deal. Of course, as a government, we have put over £4 billion is being spent in preparations for leaving the European Union with or without a deal. But as I say, there is economic analysis which shows the impact of no deal over the coming months. My own view is that over time we would be able to address the issues that arose, but there would be an immediate impact to the economy.
Vic Cooper.
The Prime Minister said that she is prepared to provide for indicative votes and also to engage constructively with the process. But she has also, and appeared to again be, many times ruled out supporting a customs union. So can I ask her, if a customs union is supported as part of some indicative votes, is she ruling out the government attempting to negotiate a customs union with the European Union?
The Right Honourable Lady has asked me on a number of occasions about a customs union. I've made my view on a customs union very clear. That, and I think those, there are a number of proposals that have been suggested over time in this House for alternative ways forward in relation to a deal. But there are a number of questions that members need to ask themselves in relation to those issues. So in talking about a customs union, what are the rules that the Right Honourable Lady would see actually being abided by? Would they involve abiding by state aid rules? In some of the proposals that have been put forward, there's a real question about free movement, and would free movement continue to be abided by? My own view is, having stood, I stood on a manifesto which made a reference to a customs union. I stood on a manifesto which made a reference to a customs union because I and the party opposite both believed we should be able to have an independent trade policy. It continues to be my view that we should have an independent trade policy in the future.
Mr. Patterson.
Speaker, the European Commission today said that all preparations for no deal had been completed, and last week in the statement the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for DEXU made clear that very good progress was being made on the UK front in preparation for no deal. So it's a bit surprising, Mr. Speaker, to hear from the Prime Minister that Northern Ireland is unable to prepare properly because it hasn't got devolved government. Which areas of government activity present a problem, and when will they be resolved?
I say to my right honourable friend, it is the Northern Ireland Civil Service do not have the powers to take the necessary decisions that would be needed in a circumstance in which there was a no deal and the UK left the European Union with a no deal. Now, it is possible to address those issues, but that had not been done by the 29th of March. The question about the impact on Northern Ireland and where there was no devolved government was an important one. And I believe that it's absolutely right that the government took the view that it was not appropriate to allow that no deal to go ahead at a time when the powers were not in place to ensure proper exercise of the decision-making necessary in a no deal situation.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, but just on that last point, the Prime Minister has known for some considerable time, and so has the House, that the 29th of March was the target date. So why hasn't appropriate preparations been made? Why do we need another 2 weeks? What's going to happen in another 2 weeks that couldn't have happened up to now? I mean, this is a fundamental lack of preparation, and the government's entirely responsible for that, if that's the case, because this is a new argument. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, this is an entirely new argument that we're hearing for the first time as to why we need extension. But could I ask the Prime Minister, further to the question that the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland raised, someone with great experience, having served, I think, 4 years in Northern Ireland, who raises the point that Leo Varadkar has made it clear that in terms of a no deal, that he is very confident there will be no border checks. Michel Barnier has said the same. Angela Merkel has said the same. She shakes her head, but that's what he said. That's what he said. So the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that this backstop problem, which has been elevated, one has to ask, and I'd like the Prime Minister's views on this, why is it that the EU insists on this when, in the case of a no deal, it doesn't need to have any checks? And why is it that the Prime Minister ever agreed to this backstop in the first place, which is the thing that bedevils her agreement?
Can I say first of all to the right honourable gentleman that actually the issue of the positioning governments of Northern Ireland in a no-deal situation, it's not the first time that it's been raised today. It was raised by my right honourable friend, the DEFRA Secretary, in the debate on no deal, which took place nearly 2 weeks ago. In relation to the question of the border checks in Northern Ireland, I would simply say to the right honourable gentleman, a number of statements are made and have been made from individuals about the situation in relation to the border in Northern Ireland. What is also clear that actually when you look at the detail of what the European Union has said, they have not said, they've made clear that European Union law would need to be adhered to in any circumstance in which there was no deal. We ourselves have said, and the right honourable gentleman is aware of this, that we would ensure that we were moving towards a period of time for a temporary period, because of the legal situation it could only be for a temporary period, of having minimal checks with exceptions. But the legal position is a different one. in relation to the necessity to be able to have certain checks taking place. And the European Union has been clear that EU law would need to be applied in all of these circumstances.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To carry on with that point that has just been raised, is the Prime Minister suggesting that in order for Northern Ireland to be ready to leave with no deal, there would need to be some form of direct decision-making by us in this House in the absence of a Stormont government?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right. If there is no Stormont government, if powers are needed and ministerial direction is needed, which is not available to the civil servants currently, it would require some form of direct application of powers here from this Westminster.
Angela Regal.
Speaker, the Prime Minister appears to have ruled out bringing back her deal for an indefinite amount of time, and yet we only have 2 weeks before we crash out without a deal. She said that she won't necessarily take notice of this House's indicative votes process, and she's also said that she will not continue as Prime Minister if we remain in the EU beyond June the 30th. This seems to be pointing directly to a prime ministerial dash for no deal. Will she actually say that that is not what she wants and tell us when she's going to abandon her deal rather than just keep postponing the vote on it?
I have always been clear that I want us to leave the European Union. My preference is for us to leave the European Union with a deal. But I have always also been clear, and it is a very simple, logical fact, that it isn't possible simply to say from honourable members that they don't want no deal. If they're going to leave the European Union, then we have to have a deal if we're not going to leave without a deal.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Given that the deal that is on offer now is exactly the same as the deal that was on offer a week ago, why does the Prime Minister think that you, Mr. Speaker, would allow it to be voted upon in this session?
Can I say to my honourable friend that I'm very clear of the strictures that the Speaker gave when he made his statement last week, and that were we to bring forward a further motion to this House, we would of course ensure that that further motion met with the requirements that the Speaker had made.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, sometimes it's hard to believe what one hears in this House these days, but we have it written down in black and white here that the Prime Minister said this afternoon that she cannot commit to delivering the outcome of any votes held by this House. Does she realise that this makes a mockery of parliamentary democracy? And will she reconsider and commit to holding a binding vote to avoid a no-deal Brexit?
To the honourable lady, that it's a very simple position. An indicative vote is exactly that, an indicative vote. I'm sure members of this House cannot expect the government simply to give a blank cheque to any vote that was that came through. For example, the SNP position is that they would like to see this House voting to revoke Article 50. This government's position is that we should deliver on the referendum result that took place in 2016 and deliver Brexit.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, you have told us in the dispatch box on 108 separate occasions that we would leave the European Union on the 29th of March. You have told the House it's now the 12th of April. But you have not changed your mind about ruling out a second referendum, unlike your Chancellor, who on Ridge yesterday effectively opened the door to it. Have you said anything to the Chancellor about this? Or has collective responsibility on your watch completely collapsed?
I think the Chancellor of the Exchequer made the point that this was one of the propositions. It is indeed one of the propositions that has been put forward. It's been referenced in questions already. It's been referenced by members across this House. But I assure my honourable friend that I have not changed my view about it. As I indicated earlier, I believe we should deliver on the result of the first referendum.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister speaks of the frustration felt by MPs. Does the Prime Minister accept that that frustration is born out of her intransigence, which is the greatest barrier to getting a deal? Following up from the question from my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, if you don't get a deal through Parliament by this Friday, then in 18 days' time, by the 12th of April, we will have to decide whether we want a longer extension or whether we want to crash out without a deal. Given that Parliament has voted twice already not to leave without a deal, will you confirm that by the 12th of April you will seek that longer extension and abide by the wishes of this Parliament?
To the honourable lady, that she's absolutely right in the results of the council meeting that took place last week. If we can guarantee Brexit and leave on the 22nd of May by agreeing a deal this week, if we fail to do that, then we will have to look, we've been clear about the commitment to facilitate seeing whether there is a majority across this House for anything. But the government cannot be expected simply to say that anything that comes through the government will accept. We all stood on manifestos. We all have positions in relation to our duty to deliver on the referendum. And I think that's important and we should keep that in our minds.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has accepted that the House is going to have so-called indicative votes to try to find if there's a majority for a way forward, but she has twice now, I think, declined to commit the government to giving effect to a majority in this House, citing the fact that she stood on a manifesto which she thinks should guide things. May I remind her that that manifesto only appeared halfway through the election campaign. I don't think it was discussed in Cabinet. It was not circulated to the candidates who were already fighting their campaigns, and nothing in that manifesto in Europe played any part in the general election campaign. We're all being asked to show pragmatism, flexibility and put the national interest first. Can I ask her to be prepared to bend from her commitment to the manifesto, apart from the one proposal that she dropped fairly promptly when the manifesto first appeared?
To my right honourable and learned friend, first of all, I don't accept the entire description that he set out there. But can I just say to my right honourable friend, I think we have looked in the whole process of negotiation. There has been compromise, but I don't think my right honourable and learned friend was a respected and long-standing member of previous governments. And I suspect that if my right honourable and learned friend had been standing at this dispatch box prior to the possibility of indicative votes, and we have to see, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster will make a reference, obviously, to the government's position when he speaks, and further explanation when he speaks later this afternoon. But if my right honourable friend, our right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset's amendment passes, then of course there will be those indicative votes. But if my right honourable and learned friend was standing here as a government minister, I don't think he would give a blank cheque. I think he is indicating his assent with what I'm suggesting.
Kate Hoey.
The Prime Minister has said once again that the European Union are not going to, under any circumstances, look again at the withdrawal agreement. So I actually agree with her that indicative votes are a nonsense, because actually, in the end, they are talking about the future relationship and not about the withdrawal agreement. But can I say to her now, why will she not start preparing properly for, and I don't call it a no deal, it's not a no deal, it's a different type of deal that would take us out from, it's a WTO deal. Why will she not continue to prepare for that and to make sure that in the end, what really matters is the people vote, not what this Parliament says.
Say to the Right Honourable Lady that I hope I've expressed my belief that we should be delivering on the result of the 2016 referendum. Can I also say to the Right Honourable Lady we continue to prepare for no deal. Those preparations are being continued.
Mr. Stephen Crabb.
I've heard many colleagues on the other side of the House say that they oppose the deal, not because they don't support the terms of the withdrawal agreement. In fact, many of them go to pains to say they do support the terms of the withdrawal agreement, but because they have problems with the political declaration. Has the Prime Minister considered providing this House with an opportunity to have votes on the terms of the withdrawal agreement and then on the political declaration to enable us to come to a view about whether the terms of our departure are acceptable to a majority of the House?
Say to my right honourable friend that, of course, throughout the debate that we've had previously, one of the concerns that many people across the House have raised was about the political declaration and the fact that it wasn't legal text, and a concern to, if you like, tie it down further, which is what we did do in our discussion with the European Union. But I'm sure my right honourable friend has also seen the terms of the terms of the Council conclusions, but we've always worked to ensure that the political declaration could be firmed up, if one likes, to describe it as such, to give greater confidence in that sort of future relationship.
Very good indeed to see the honourable gentleman member for Wolverhampton South East back in his place and manifestly in rude health. Mr. Pat McFadden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pitching Parliament against the people undermines parliamentary democracy and feeds the far right. Does the Prime Minister regret her use of words last Wednesday night?
First of all, can I echo the Speaker's comments to say how good it is to see the right honourable gentleman back in his place. I was trying to make a very simple point last week, which is that this is a moment of decision for Parliament. We gave the people the choice. The people gave their decision. Parliament needs to deliver on that decision. And the time has come for Parliament to decide.
Sarah Newton.
I very much agree with my right honourable friend. This is the moment for Parliament to decide. And while I would very happily vote for the withdrawal agreement and the future declaration for a third time, other colleagues won't. So could my right honourable friend give us a bit more information about how the government is going to enable the House to come to a solution for a plan B so she can go back to the EU and make sure that we deliver on what all of us said we would do in this House, well, the main political parties said that they would do, and that is deliver Brexit with a deal.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her question, and the opportunity will come for the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster in the debate that follows this statement to set out in a little more detail how the government sees the processes going forward over the next few days. It is, of course, the case that the European Union Council has made clear that the withdrawal agreement does remain closed and will not be reopened. And it's against that background, of course, that Parliament would look at any options that it brought forward.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can say, and I think on behalf of a lot of honourable and right honourable members, I was proud to march with the people. Those 1 million people from all over the United Kingdom, of all backgrounds and all generations, that came to London on a precious Saturday because they want this matter to go back to the people. Mr. Speaker, the people of this country are crying out for leadership, and businesses are crying out for certainty. And in this Prime Minister, they are not getting either of those things. The Prime Minister was asked twice now by honourable members, right honourable members, on this side of the House, come April the 12th, if her withdrawal agreement has not been passed by this House, what is her plan B? Because she still hasn't told us, Mr. Speaker. Is it going to be no deal or a lengthy extension? Prime Minister, just answer the question.
Can I point out to the right honourable lady, she talks about the response of business. Business was very clear that it wanted this House to support the deal. Yes, business was very clear that it wanted the House to support the deal. When we get to the point, you see, some members, honourable members and right honourable members, are saying to me, the government should say now, what will you do on the 11th of April? Others are saying, listen to the House and do whatever the House says on the 11th of April. These two are not entirely compatible.
Sir Edward Lee.
Has the Prime Minister noted the fourth section of the European Council conclusions, which state any unilateral commitment, statement or other act should be compatible with the letter and spirit of the withdrawal agreement? In noting the words any and should and the tense of this conclusion, does the Prime Minister conclude with me that it would be legally enforceable and allowable for the United Kingdom to give further interpretation on a unilateral declaration to reassure colleagues on our ability to exit the backstop?
Right honourable friend is right to draw attention to that conclusion. There are certain commitments which we, unilateral commitments, we've made unilateral commitments in relation to Northern Ireland. We've indicated we're prepared to make those unilateral commitments. And certainly that my right honourable friend has raised before this question of the application of international law, and we are looking again at how we can reflect that properly in any papers that are brought forward.
Mary Cray.
Minister's deal has been rejected twice, and no deal has been rejected twice by this Parliament, and yet she stands here today threatening that we leave with no deal on April the 12th if her deal is not approved this week, and saying that she will whip her colleagues tonight to vote against the very process for which the EU has granted that extension. We are now in the levels of theatre of the absurd. 1 million people stood in Parliament Square demanding their right to be heard. If MPs can have 3 votes in 3 months, why can't the people have 2 votes in 3 years?
Can I say to the right honourable lady that there are 2 ways in which the extension has been granted by the European Union Council. The first, of course, is for us to exit on the 22nd of May with a deal, if this House were to agree a deal this week. The second is to provide for a possibility of the United Kingdom going forward to the European Union with some plan as to take that forward if the deal has not been agreed. I indicated in my statement why it is the case that the government will be whipping against the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. And there are elements about this issue of Brexit, but there are also elements about the precedent that sets for the future, for the relationship between this House and the Executive.
O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I voted for the withdrawal agreement before, and I will willingly back to the Prime Minister and vote for it again. But I owe it to my constituents that if that should not pass, I have the opportunity to debate in full the alternatives. The Prime Minister urges us against the so-called let-win proposal, if I may put it that way, tonight, but says the government will bring time for alternatives to be considered. But can I press her again, as my honourable friend, the member for Truro and Falmouth did? Well, if that's to be the case, when?
I was going to say to my honourable friend, I hope that he would have a little more patience, because the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster will set out more details on this in relation to the... The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster will set out more details in relation to this. We stand by the commitment that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster gave in this House, that if it were the case that we had not, were in the position of not having got a deal through, then in the 2 weeks after the European Union Council, that the government would facilitate that opportunity for people to look at the other options.
Peter Kyle.
The Prime Minister accused MPs of wasting time and playing games, but can I just remind her, it wasn't MPs that made her sign Article 50 before she was ready for the negotiations. It wasn't MPs that made her call a general election in the middle of the Article 50 process. It wasn't MPs that made her burn through 3 Brexit secretaries in 2 years. And it wasn't MPs that made her set red lines that could never pass this House. She has spoken consistently about compromise, but what she really has meant is capitulation. If she is really in the mood for compromise now, can I urge her to meet with those of us who are truly trying to work through and get a compromise to this place that can work for her and us?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I think I've said in this House before that I'm happy to meet with him and other members of this House, which I have, and I have been meeting, and as the Leader of the Opposition indicated, I met with him earlier this afternoon. But can I also just I have indicated that I am happy to meet members of this House to discuss these issues. But can I also remind the honourable gentleman, when he refers to triggering Article 50, this House voted to trigger Article 50. When he refers to the general election, actually the House voted for the general election.
Rachel McLean.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister confirm that it is not the government's intention to hold European parliamentary elections? Because my constituents in Redditch who voted to leave the EU nearly 3 years ago would find that completely unacceptable.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I absolutely agree. I think people would ask what on earth we were doing if we, having voted to leave the EU nearly 3 years ago, then found themselves electing members to the European Parliament. But of course, the way in which we can ensure that we don't have to do that is to ensure we leave the European Union by the 22nd of May, and that is only possible if a deal is agreed this week.
Stephen Doughty.
Speaker, like many other members of this House, I was proud to walk alongside the over 1 million people in the streets on Saturday. And I walked along at one point alongside two youngsters and their family, and they were carrying a banner that said, "Votes, PM 3, people 1. Now, this is a very, very fundamental point. Can the Prime Minister explain to all the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of young people up and down this country why she gets to have multiple votes on a deal that's been rejected by this House and is not supported by the country, and why the people don't get a chance to say whether they want to go ahead with a deal that this House can agree on?
That's right. Say to the honourable gentleman, this House votes on many occasions on many different issues. This House, one of the things this House voted on was to ask the people of this country whether or not we should leave the European Union. The people gave that decision. At the time, the government said it would abide by that decision, that it was not an advisory decision. It was effectively an instruction to this House. It was a duty of this House to be able to abide by that, and that's what we should be doing.
Crispin Blunt.
Does the Prime Minister understand that by taking no deal off the table at the behest of this Remainer Parliament, she has just put the final torpedo into her own deal and any real prospect of Brexit, and that her statement will represent the most shameful surrender by a British leader since Singapore in 1942?
Can I simply say to my right honourable friend that what I said in my statement was that this House has voted twice to reject no deal and may very well continue to vote to reject no deal, and may very well, as a House, attempt to ensure that no deal cannot take place. As the SNP have already indicated, they will be moving a vote to revoke Article 50, which would be to reverse the whole result of the referendum. I continue to want, and I also might point out to my right honourable friend that members opposite have been complaining that I have refused in my answers to take no deal off the table. The reality is that this House has shown its intention to do everything it can to take no deal off the table, and we all need to recognise that if we're going to deliver on Brexit, then we need to recognise that situation.
Sammy Wilson.
Prime Minister, the current difficulty which you face all hangs around the withdrawal agreement and the way in which Northern Ireland has been pulled into these discussions. This weekend, the Irish Government have made it quite clear that the whole premise of the withdrawal agreement is based on a foundation of sand. There will be no checks along the Irish border, therefore no threat to peace in Northern Ireland, therefore no disruption to the island of Ireland. And now today we're told that it's because Northern Ireland is not prepared. Yet all of the preparations which are done by central government apply to Northern Ireland. All of them apply to Northern Ireland. When are you going to stop using Northern Ireland as an excuse, and do you realise that the importance of this agreement to delivering Brexit and also to the unity of the United Kingdom is such that we will not be used in any scare tactics to push this through?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that what I have genuinely been trying to achieve through everything that I have been doing is ensuring that we respect the wishes of the people of Northern Ireland and we respect Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. Now, it is the case, as I say, that these remarks about the border have been made by, I think I'm right in saying, by the Taoiseach and others previously, and then they've been contradicted by the European Commission in terms of what might be necessary. So I merely say, well, the situation in relation to the European Union's proposal is that it's been very clear about European Union laws and the necessity of those EU laws being applied.
Order. I have no wish to distract from the importance of the matters, but there's been quite a lot of naughty behaviour this afternoon, including by the Honourable Gentleman Member for East Antrim and the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Rayleigh in Wickford in repeatedly using the word "you," which is unparliamentary. So I am looking to a custodian of our fine traditions of parliamentary courtesy, and I need look no further than Victoria Prentice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know about you, but I think that the 2017 Conservative Manifesto is possibly not bedtime reading in many households. So let me remind the House briefly. We want to agree a deep and special partnership with the European Union. This partnership will benefit both the European Union and the United Kingdom. While we are leaving the European Union, we are not leaving Europe, and we want to remain committed partners and allies to our friends. Does the Prime Minister think that any of the indicative votes which we may be able to cast on Wednesday, aside from that on the meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement, will be covered by that manifesto? And if so, will she whip us to vote in any particular way?
Well, my honourable friend is tempting me to indicate what we might do. We don't know what the options are. We don't know what the options that will be chosen or the sequence in which those will be chosen. But she's absolutely right to point out that we stood on a particular manifesto. We stood on a manifesto to honour the result of the referendum. The Labour Party stood on a manifesto to honour the result of the referendum. I think there is a way to honour the result of the referendum, and it's a pity we haven't been able to agree that.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister talks of frustration with Parliament. She also today, on a number of occasions, has said today is decision time. But given that she is not putting her deal to another vote, and she is preventing this House and not allowing this House to have indicative votes, could she advise us on how we are to express our decision?
First of all, can I say to the Honourable Lady that actually what I said was, as things stand, I wasn't bringing the meaningful vote back, but I continue to have discussions with colleagues across the House to build support so we can bring the vote forward this week and guarantee Brexit. The process, in the absence of a meaningful vote, in the absence of agreeing the deal this week, the process will be referred to by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the debate that will take place after this statement. And, of course, there is the amendment down by my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, which gives an indication and a timetable were that amendment to be passed. I will be whipping against that amendment for the reasons I set out earlier.
James Cutledge.
If we go to indicative votes and we look at other options, the issue of free movement is likely to feature. Now, I strongly agree with the Prime Minister that the public want us to end free movement, but must we not recognise that immigration into this country from outside the European Union is now running at a 15-year high of 261,000. That's more than Ipswich and Colchester combined. Should we not therefore have some candour and say to the public that if we end free movement, immigration is unlikely to fall, it will simply come from much further afield?
Can I say to my honourable friend, over time, the government has taken a number of actions to ensure that we can deal with introducing more control into our immigration system. That is one of the advantages of ending free movement, is that actually we can bring an entirely new immigration system into place, which enables it to be skills-based rather than based on where somebody has, the country that somebody comes from. But I also believe that what underpinned, for many people, what underpinned their vote and desire to leave the European Union was a desire to see free movement end, and that's why it is absolutely right that the proposals the government has put forward would indeed do that.
Seema Malhotra.
Speaker, the fact that the Prime Minister has had to ask EU leaders for an Article 50 extension last week was a highly predictable outcome from an inflexible Prime Minister who has consistently sought to sideline Parliament and the country over the last 2 years. So further to the question by the Right Honourable Member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, if through indicative votes this House votes, for example, in favour of a Norway-based deal or a customs union, will she shift her red lines in line with the will of this House? Or will we come out of this process and her constructive engagement to find that nothing has changed?
I answered in my statement. I set out the position of the government in relation to the indicative votes, and that remains the government's position.
Jeremy Lefroy.
No harm done at all. Mr. Speaker, further to the question from my right honourable friend for Pembroke Preseli, would the Prime Minister agree that there is perhaps a majority across this House for the withdrawal agreement on its own, given that there needs to be a little bit more work done on the terms of the backstop, and that actually the political declaration is very close to the manifestos of both the Conservative and the Labour Party in 2017, and again, with a little bit more work, there should be a majority with goodwill across this House for the agreement.
The honourable friend is right that there are those across this House who obviously have concerns, continuing concerns with the withdrawal agreement, but many across the House who do not have those concerns in relation to the withdrawal agreement, but who do have concerns about the certainty of the future in the political declaration. The political declaration does provide for a spectrum of options in relation to our trading relationship for the future. I think we certainly stood on a manifesto commitment to have that independent trade policy. We want to see that delivered in the agreement we have with the European Union, but others in this House also stood on a basis of having that independent trade policy, and moving into a permanent customs union does not deliver on that independent trade policy.
Chris Leslie.
May I just press the Prime Minister a little further on this notion she may scuttle any outcome of indicative votes because perhaps they're not negotiable with the European Union. She knows, because the Chancellor told us so yesterday, that a confirmatory referendum, a people's vote, is a perfectly viable proposition. I want to know, and I don't want to interrupt her while she's on her phone, but if she wouldn't mind... Well, she was on the phone, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, you were.
I'd like her to answer specifically whether she regards a confirmatory referendum as something which, if this House agreed it, she would also perhaps not abide by that particular outcome. Yes or no?
Gentleman. And I apologise to the honourable gentleman. Just a little bit of female multitasking trying to take place there. But I do think, because in terms of the confirmatory, the concept of the confirmatory vote, that is often attached not just to being a confirmatory vote, but actually to having Remain on the ballot paper, so that actually it is effectively a second referendum on whether or not we should leave the European Union. As I've indicated earlier, I believe we should be leaving the European Union because that's what people voted for in the first referendum.
Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we must leave the EU, to do so without a deal would decimate agriculture in North Dorset, which is why I have supported the Prime Minister's deal on both occasions and will do so again whenever she asks me to. However, she's indicated that the statutory instrument to confirm the extension to the withdrawal period has been laid before the House. Could she advise when it will be debated and voted upon?
It will be debated and voted upon later this week. I think I can inform my honourable friend, obviously, that I'm happy to inform my honourable friend outside of this statement when I've checked which day, but it will be debated on one day later this week.
Emma Reynolds.
The Prime Minister says in her statement that she cannot commit the government to delivering the outcome of any votes in this House. So if her deal fails to get through this week, and if we hold indicative votes and a majority of MPs vote for an alternative to her deal, is she really saying that she is going to ignore the democratic will of this House and she would prefer to crash out without a deal then respect the will of this House.
First of all, say, if the Honourable Lady will permit me, I have just checked, and in fact it will be Wednesday that the statutory instrument will be debated on. Can I say to the Honourable Lady that it's not... look, this House has passed motions saying that it does not want no deal. It may very well pass more motions saying that it does not want no deal. But if it is going to deliver on ensuring that it does not have no deal, then it has to agree a deal. It is very simple. It isn't enough simply to say that the House doesn't want no deal.
Mr. David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister inadvertently failed to answer the second part of the question of my honourable friend, the member for Stone. Can she please say when the order will be, the commencement order will be made under the provisions of Section 25, subsection 4 of the Withdrawal Act? This, as she will know, is a matter of particular importance.
Yes, and I apologise for not answering the question to my honourable friend, the member for Stone. And if my right honourable friend will permit me, I will confirm that point and come back to my right honourable, both of my honourable friends when I'm able to do that.
Chris Stevens.
Speaker, given the political crisis the Prime Minister faces, does she think it would be better if the Cabinet met in public, given that all the details are diligently being leaked to the media on every single occasion? But does that not always suggest that the Cabinet is also in deadlock, and the only way to break this impasse is either a second referendum or a general election?
I think the honourable gentleman has heard my answers to the question on the second referendum on many occasions, and I continue to believe that it is not in the best interests of this House. I think it's in the best interests of this House to agree for us to deliver on Brexit, to do it in a smooth and orderly way, and not to go down the route of either a second referendum or a general election.
Luke Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I voted for the withdrawal agreement twice before, and I would do so again. But can I actually say that I welcome my right honourable friend's movement? I welcome my right honourable friend's movement towards indicative votes, because I think they will be helpful. And can my right honourable friend confirm that there will be a full range of workable options, including EFTA, so that we can debate and actually decide in this House?
Yep. Can I say to my honourable friend, I think it is the purpose of any such votes is to determine the views of this House, and I think it's appropriate for this House to bring the options forward that it wishes to see being debated.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's time that we recognise that beyond those who are polarised, both in this place and outside, the overwhelming number of members across this House, but also across the British public, want us to come to some sort of compromise and move on and move forward. There are, for some people, no deal is going to be ever good enough, either those who want to crash out with no deal or those who want to overturn the referendum. And it's already been said that actually in many parts there is agreement with the withdrawal agreement, but there are concerns about the future relationship on trade and also security going forward. So could I ask the Prime Minister, could she assure the House today that if we do agree the withdrawal agreement, and I've voted for it once because I think it's the right thing for my constituents and the country to move on, that in the next stage, when we get into the detailed discussions around trade and other matters, this House will have to be able to, in detail, explore what those options are, be able to debate them and vote on them.
To the right honourable lady, that first of all I agree with the sentiment that she's expressed, that I think most members of the public certainly want to see this resolved and want to see us able to move on. In relation to the future relationship, there are differences of opinion across the House, around the House, about the nature of that future trade relationship. But I've already indicated, as I did a while back, that in the next stage of negotiations there will be a greater involvement for members of this House than there was in the first stage of negotiations.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't yet met a constituent who envies the Prime Minister her task of trying to deliver us leaving the European Union responsibly. But quite apart from the concerns of manufacturing and farming and the clear view of this House, does my right honourable friend agree with me that in the absence of a political agreement between the parties of Northern Ireland to govern that country, it would be irresponsible for any government to push ahead with no deal? And if she does agree that, Is that absolutely clear to all members of the House, especially on this side, so that we can focus on what the advantages of her proposals are?
I think my honourable friend makes an important point, and it is about the responsibility to ensure that we do have appropriate governance in a situation in a no-deal situation, where significant decisions would need to be made. And it is entirely right and proper, I think, that the government has taken the position that it has in relation to that matter.
Christine Jardine.
The Prime Minister has told this House on numerous occasions that she is committed to delivering the will of the people as it was expressed almost 3 years ago now. But given that 1 million people took to the streets at the weekend, that more than 5.5 million have signed a petition, and everyone who's ever sat on these benches knows that the will of the British people can change, would the Prime Minister not agree with me that perhaps the time has come to check that the will of the British people has not, in fact, changed, and that perhaps they want something different from they wanted 3.5 years ago?
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady that I have answered this question on a number of occasions now, and I refer her to the answer I gave earlier.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister's deal is not to come back before the House, I believe it is vitally important that this House has the opportunity to consider across parties what it can agree on. The Prime Minister has kindly indicated that parliamentary time will be given over for that process. But can she indicate, notwithstanding that we're going to be getting a statement from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, can she herself indicate, as Prime Minister, by when those votes will take place?
The first point to make, of course, although I've indicated we would whip against the amendment from my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, is that if his amendment were passed, then that would lead to certainly some votes taking place on Wednesday of this week. The commitment that the government has made is that over this week and next week, there would be opportunities. That was what my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, indicated, that in the 2 weeks following last week's European Union Council, we would facilitate the opportunity for the House to make those decisions.